Welcome to the lecture on the rise of the medieval university. In his recent book, Intellectual Culture in Medieval Paris, Theologians and the University, Ian Way lists three areas of focus identified by historians interested in the rise of universities in medieval Europe. First, the emergence of universities has been explained in terms of conflict between scholars and both local ecclesiastical authorities and the town authorities. The second type of explanation stresses debates amongst learned men, and especially the development of shared educational ideals to which the emerging universities gave expression. The third approach treats the university as a product of its urban environment. Scholars deliberately copied artisans and merchants. Their classrooms were like workshops. They sold knowledge in the way that artisans and merchants sold their goods. And the university, therefore, was like a guild like any other trade guild. Way's point in listing these three themes is that all three need to be kept in mind, and that our job is to try to understand how these three factors interact. A number of the points I'll be raising in the lecture build on and assume your familiarity with Chapter 10 of our textbook, Reform and Renewal in the Greater West. The earliest known charter of a European university is from 1215 for the University of Paris. Let's take a look at some of the things that it contained. It begins like this. Robert, servant of the cross of Christ by divine pity, cardinal priest of the title, St. Stephen in Mount Caelius, legate of the Apostolic See. To all the masters and scholars of Paris, eternal greeting in the Lord. Let all know that since we have had a special mandate from the Pope to take effective measures to reform the state of the Parisian scholars for the better, wishing with the counsel of good men to provide for the tranquility of the scholars in the future, we have decreed and ordained in this wise. This charter is the work of Robert of Courson, formerly the Chancellor of Paris, and in that role was in charge of the masters and the students of the cathedral. The authority that he invokes in the charter is as the legate of the Pope, in this case, Pope Innocent III. His authority derives from the Pope and is being exercised from Rome in Paris. For now, we'll skip over the details, to which we'll return in a bit, to look at how the charter closes. Moreover, that these decrees may be observed inviolate, we, by virtue of our legatine authority, have bound by the knot of excommunication all who shall contumaciously presume to go against these our statutes, unless within 15 days after the offense they have taken care to amend their presumption before the university of masters and scholars or other persons constituted by the university, done in the year of grace 1215, the month of August. In this lecture, I will take a post-confessional approach. Maureen Miller explains the approach. Quote, a post-confessional history of the papacy or any religious institution or practice would set aside questions of whether a belief or development was right or wrong, good or bad, and concentrate on how and why ideas and practices develop, considering all possible models and influences, not just those articulated or favored by the adherents. This is not simply a case of the fairly obvious methodological skepticism that prudent scholarship requires. Post-confessional means to try to step outside the framework of the believer. In keeping with this post-confessional approach to the university, I won't consider if it was good or bad that in 1215 the Pope intervenes in a municipal squabble in Paris. Instead, I'll consider how and why the Pope did, and I will not restrict myself to considering just the explanations offered by the participants. In many respects, the post-confessional approach is easy to justify and apply to our topic. There's a far more intractable challenge for us. The post-confessional approach is meant to isolate the effect of a religious bias on our analysis of the rise of the university. But what about the university bias? Could we have something like a post-university approach? I don't think that we can, and that's the main underlying theme for this lecture. Taking a careful look at the university as it develops in medieval feudal Europe can help us take a critical look at ourselves and our society. Just as in 1215, in 2021, the university, the students and the professors, the administrators and the corporations that increasingly fund and direct our work are at, or rather near, the center of contemporary society. So let's return to the charter. The authority of the Pope is invoked not only to govern the internal operation of the university, but is also outward looking. The Pope, through his legate, grants to the university the power to excommunicate people who fail to conform to the university's operations. What are the scholars and masters up to? Why is the Pope getting involved? They are training and preparing young men to become priests. My aim in this lecture is to connect for you the training of priests, the role of priests in the church, and the nature of the complex relations between what we think of today as religion and politics and economics, the three areas listed by way. My main point is to underscore the extent to which the distinction between religion and politics as absolutely separate human phenomena is unhelpful and misleading in trying to understand the significance and the mechanisms through which the university rose in the medieval period, and even meaningless in the sense that it would not have made any sense to the participants. Religion and politics in the Middle Ages were not analytically separable phenomena. To an important degree, religion and politics, as they currently structure our contemporary social world, begin the long process of distinguishing themselves from each other, and the university historically becomes a key institution through which this distinction operates. The argument that I'm offering here is partly derived from the work of the contemporary Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben. As he put it, the story of the liturgy is, in this sense, the mystery of effectiveness. And only if one understands this arcane secret is it possible to understand the enormous influence that this practice, which is only apparently separate, has exercised on the way in which modernity has thought both its ontology and its ethics, its politics and its economy. This exploration of what he calls the mystery of the liturgy is from a book called Opus Dei, The Archaeology of Duty. This is the larger background for this lecture. My claim is that the rise of the university allows us to understand a bit better the ways that we moderns, professors and students, citizens and individuals, are subjects of duty. It's the university's success in producing such subjects that helps to explain its long institutional life. In his work, as I read him, Agamben puts a great deal of the stress on the mystery side of his account. For our purposes, it's on the effectiveness side that I'm laying the stress, analyzing the effects that church practices, as practiced in the period we're looking at, had on society in relation to the rise of the university, will allow us to better see how the university today continues to have an impact on politics and the economy in their modern configuration. Let's return to the Charter to continue to think about the role of priests in medieval society and try to locate them in the power dynamics of that society. One place to start is to understand excommunication, or perhaps more particularly, the threat of excommunication. Excommunication meant being prevented from participating in the practices of the Catholic Church. It's a formalized version of a practice observed in many societies: shunning, exile. Excommunication in Paris in 1215 would not have been simply a matter of not being allowed to go to church. If you were excommunicated, you would not be allowed to marry, you would not be buried, you would not be allowed to swear oaths, since the effectiveness of oaths depended on being a member in good standing of the community, a community that defined itself as a community of faith. An oath is only effective in securing for the oath taker this joint membership in a community. I want to spend a bit of time with this. Oaths were still crucial in European society at this time. It was, and would remain for a very long time, to a very great degree, an oral society, and a society held together by the ability of most people to take most other people at their spoken word. The textbook calls these feudal bonds and gives a brief account of their development. The textbook calls these feudal bonds and gives a brief account of their development. In many ways, this is the crucial dimension of the mechanism through which the university became increasingly central to and part of the broader social changes we observe having occurred in medieval Europe, changes with which the rest of chapter 10 describe in helpful detail. The Pope, seeking to consolidate and project his authority in France, issues a charter to protect a certain group of people against the potentially competing authority, not only of the king, but also from within the existing power structure of the local church. The use of charters was a relatively new mechanism in the 11th century. Seeing charters as an innovative technology of power allows us to draw a straight line between the rise of the university and some of the central changes in medieval society. Changes forced on that society by population growth and the increased demand occasioned by that growth for the production of the necessities of life. How is a charter a technology of power, and what does it have to do with the training of priests? Recall the post-confessional approach. How and why did the particular religious practices change? Why did the Pope involve himself, and why then, and how? Why? Because the Pope is concerned with losing power to local aristocratic powers, in the case of Paris, the King of France, but also to losing power to factions within the church. Involving himself in the training of priests is one way to secure their ongoing support and their future support against both external, that is, from our point of view, political, municipal, royal influences, and also from challenges to papal authority from within the church itself. So how does he do it? He sends his envoy, the papal legate, armed with what is called in the charter legatine authority, and he sends this envoy with a charter, a written document that asserts the Pope's authority in general on an issue with which the papacy had not previously been involved, and in particular with the mechanisms through which the church will reproduce itself, through which it will ensure its ongoing survival in society. The training of priests ensures the reproduction of the institution by training the future members of its hierarchy in the required skills to perpetuate the work of the church. That the charter survived is largely a matter of luck, but it highlights for us the wider and wider use of charters by popes and also by many of the other groups seeking to exercise and expand their authority in that world. Not only kings and lesser aristocrats also issue charters in order, among other reasons, but crucially, as we'll see in a minute, to expand, protect, and to try to control commercial activities in the cities, but also by, or at least on behalf of, guilds and organized groups of peasants and city workers forming themselves into groups called communes and guilds, issuing charters which asserted for the members of the guilds or the organized peasants their own prerogatives and rights against the exercise of the authority of the nobles and the nobility and the church hierarchy. This is one important dimension of seeing the charters as technologies of power. Once they are in use and have demonstrated their effectiveness, they can be used by any group that can figure out ways to turn it to their advantage. The technology emerges in one particular context, but as a technology, it can be reorganized and resuited for the purposes of different groups in that society. The increase in the use of charters testifies to its relative success as a new mechanism for regulating conflict in medieval society. But again, what does this have to do with priests and the university? The effectiveness of charters in regulating conflict depended then, as conflict regulation depends still today, on the parties to the conflict accepting the terms of the conflict, that is, on recognizing themselves as engaged in the conflict as structured by the norms on which the conflict resolution is predicated. The Pope's charter was effective because, and to the degree that, the scholars, the masters, recognized his authority, not just in general, not just as the Pope of the Catholic faith, but specifically with respect to their own differences as scholars and as masters. So far, so good. The Pope telling people involved in a conflict that is recognizably a religious issue is one thing. The measure of the effectiveness of charters is revealed by its effectiveness in drawing into its binding power the other parties in this conflict: municipal authorities, local landlords, and the King of France, whose capital Paris was. Of course, conflict resolution today, as it did back then, can often be achieved through violence and death. But it can also be achieved by convincing people to engage with the emerging conflict resolution mechanisms. Violence as a strategy of control is much more expensive, at least in the long run, than convincing people. One of the things that priests did was to administer the sacraments of the Catholic Church, marking, celebrating, giving meaning to the key events in human life, giving them meaning not primarily in an individual sense, but in a communal, social sense. Birth, marriage, and death are all experienced and described as and constructed as events in and of the community. The rituals through which these events are produced as meaningful involve simultaneously actions, gestures, objects, words, as well as a concern for the correct attitude to be assumed by the participants. The priests were in the business in a church ceremony, at a funeral, at a wedding, in a service. The priests were in the business of telling a story that not only accompanied these rituals, which permitted the smooth-ish operation of a life of cooperation among humans against a background condition of scarcity and conflict and competing interests, but this story also described the consequences of failing to conform to the expectations within which this community life was carried out. In that very material way, telling a story, accompanying a ritual, legitimating and engaging and drawing the community in and drawing the community together, material in this sense, in that very material way, priests produced Christian subjects. That is, people who did what the Pope wanted because they believed that that's what God wants. This has an immediate ideological consequence for the distribution of power in any given society. Insofar as it's easier to get people to do what they already want to do, if you can convince them to want what you want, then you can spare yourself the expense of arming a bunch of knights and sending them in to knock some heads to enforce compliance. For most of human history, elites have figured this out and have managed to maintain their elite standing by balancing the two options. Convince when you can, but have a plan B ready. The US president, in defense of early 20th century US imperialist policy, explained it quite clearly. Speak softly, but carry a big stick. The charters were part of both strategies. I described the charters as a technology a few minutes ago, and I want to try to spell that out briefly. Compliance is achieved through this emerging technology by transforming the personal authority of the Pope into an institutionally sanctioned and materially realized power. This materiality would have already been familiar to the Christian communities of medieval Europe. One of the central rituals of the Catholic Church is called the Holy Communion. It is the reenactment of Christ's sacrifice for the salvation of humanity. Near the end of the Catholic service, the parishioners eat a piece of bread that symbolizes Christ as both a human and as a God. The priest, by virtue of having undergone the training ultimately supervised by and through the university, turns an ordinary piece of bread into the body of Christ. And by eating the piece of bread, the participants in the ritual publicly reaffirm their membership in the community. In the Eucharist, God is made real in an everyday object through the actions of the priest, an action whose power, whose effectiveness is intimately, mysteriously tied to God's will as it is expressed in a book, the Bible. A contemporary Catholic philosopher has put the ceremony as the Eucharist, has put it like this. The Eucharist calls for two kinds of response from us. It calls for the piety of prayer and the piety of thinking, of theological reflection. It is obvious why the Eucharist makes these demands. In our Christian faith, the author says, the Eucharist reenacts the central action that God performed in the world, the redemptive death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. This action was performed not only through the power of the divine nature, but also through the human nature that the Word of God had assumed in the Incarnation. Redemption was the work of both God and man, a divine and a human accomplishment. This saving event of the death and resurrection of Christ is made present again in the Eucharist. It is the substance of the Eucharistic celebration. Another recent example of that, recent examples of this could easily be multiplied. Let me start over, I'm sorry. Other examples of this could easily be multiplied across the centuries, but another recent title, as clearly as I can think of, expresses this. Reinhard Hutter's book, Aquinas on Transubstantiation, the Real Presence of Christ in the Eucharist. The connection I'm stressing is Jesus as the incarnation, specifically of the figure of the Word of God, and the connection that the ritual makes between God as Word and the work of human reason, of discourse, of human reason. The textbook devotes a few helpful pages to the intellectual production that the medieval university is best known for under the label of scholasticism. Our focus today is not on the details of the content of that enormous, complex, often brilliant body of written work, but rather on the longer-term impact of the university as an institution. And so let's return to that. Speaking of priests and their role in the church, in church services, priests thus can be thought of as, in a sense, operating at the intersection of words and God's will. It's perhaps worth reinforcing that in this period, very few people could read. The Bible, in ways I'm suggesting are directly related to the charters, has its effects not only through the meaning of the words it contains, but also by reinforcing the gap between those who can read and those who cannot read, leaving them at the requiring of them the necessity of the mediation of God's will through those words by someone who can read, who has acquired that ability. Like the Eucharist, the physical manifestation of Christ's real presence, and also the Bible, all three are objects that manifest, that make real the reality, the effectiveness of God in this world. The Charter's effectiveness leveraged this kind of association in the broader population. It leveraged it differentially according to one's social position. Those who could read had available to them the content of the charter as a text. Those who could not read had available to them the power of that charter as a manifestation, as an expression of the Pope's will and the Pope's authority in their community. In the same year as the charter of the university was proclaimed, 1215, the Pope also convened the Fourth Lateran Council. Among the many items agreed to at this council was the papal decree that it was a necessary obligation of all Christians to take communion at least once a year. In this way, the role of priests is reasserted. The impact of the priest, the necessity of having a priest in your community is reinforced by the requirement that at least once a year, to remain a member of the Catholic Church, one had to take communion. In this way, the role of priests is reasserted, and the straight line I mentioned becomes a bit more clearly marked out. The Pope gets to set the terms under which priests will be hired and trained, and the Pope makes a rule that in order to remain a member in good standing in the church, you had to take communion. you had to engage in an activity that required the presence of a priest. I quoted Agamben to the effect that the mystery of the liturgy is, in this sense, the mystery of effectiveness. And only if one understands this arcane secret is it possible to understand the enormous influence that this praxis, which is only apparently separate, has exercised on the way in which modernity has thought its politics and its economy. The power of the priest did not only manifest itself through his participation in controlling the borders of the religious community, that is, in certifying membership in the community at birth through baptism, or in sanctioning the unions that would be allowed to go forward through weddings, and ensuring the connection to the past through funerals and burials, and administering the last rites. But the priest's effect was also felt in the everyday interactions that marked the lives of parishioners, for local priests and for the nobles and their bishops and archbishops and cardinals. They did this through their role as the mediators, as the guarantors of the value, the meaning of giving one's word, and of having that word count in all of the transactions that allow everyday life to occur. For the very large majority of Europe's population at this time, this involved a very small number of people, a low level of density of networks characterized human society until very recently, until the beginning of modernity, or for Europe in roughly the 19th century. But the stakes of these interactions, even at this low level of density, were often life and death. Everything we know about life in Europe at that time tells us that the margins for survival relative to today were very thin. Starvation on a significant scale was a reality for most of the planet's population until fairly recently. It was a requirement of survival, a matter of getting enough to eat over the course of a lifetime, that cooperation operate within some tolerable level of efficiency. Where that cooperation broke down, the low level of productivity of European society meant that lives would be lost. It was a condition of survival to be able to develop mechanisms of cooperation that allowed for the sharing of resources and effort and cooperate and so on. Another crucial consideration can be introduced here. I argued that the effect of the priest's work in the community was, among other things, to create and support a certain socially necessary minimum level of trust among the members of the community through carrying out of their pastoral duties. I mentioned that the population of Europe grew at a very significant rate. The church adapted to this not simply by hiring and training more and more priests, but in order to survive, it also had to respond to the increasing administrative demands that this growth imposed. These administrative demands were all the greater in the case of the church because it occurred in the context of great power struggles within the church and between the church and the secular authorities. These secular authorities were themselves undergoing the exact same sorts of pressures. The administrative demands on the growing royal administration and the ducal administrations and the administrations that the higher members of the nobility, as their power grew, also responded by developing castle and royal administrations following the same trajectory as the trajectory followed by the church. In fact, often hiring the same people and people from the same family. Here again, I I point you to the chapters 10 and 11 in the textbook for a more complete account of these developments. This increased administrative burden is another dimension of the sense in which the charters can be seen as part of an innovation in the technologies of power through the written word. If we return to the charter briefly, we can see how it fulfills this dual mandate. Also, the masters and scholars can make both between themselves and with other persons obligations and constitutions, supported by faith or penalty or oath in these cases. Namely, the murder or mutilation of a scholar or atrocious injury done a scholar, if justice should not be forthcoming, arranging the prices of lodgings, costume, burial, lectures, and disputations. So, however, that the university not thereby be dissolved or destroyed. What this passage from the Charter is meant to illustrate for us is that it invokes the awesome power of the Pope, not only to ensure, as we saw from the first slide, the contemplative tranquility required for spiritual devotion and more on its face appropriate for a religious institution, but it also, and at the same time, and through the same document, through the same machine, through the same technology, sets the prices of shoes and the rent that can be charged and the cost, the tuition costs that the masters can require of the students. The university sees itself created through a mechanism which itself became an important conduit for the expansion of the power of the church and of the elite classes, and also, more rarely but crucially, for resistance and pushback from the subjected classes. I mentioned earlier that although the majority of charters were used by those sections of the society that enjoyed the greatest amount of power, the charter as a technology was also availed of by other segments in society under those competing circumstances when they were able to muster enough resources and enough know-how to be able to use those charters, those technologies for their own purposes. It's through the university that very slowly writing, the written word, the text, the document, come to acquire the importance that they eventually acquired that they have acquired in the modern world. And this, I will argue, has everything to do with the rising importance of cities in the medieval West. I'm not the only one to argue. Everyone agrees with this. To understand the changes in urban life in the period, I'll have to say a few things about the general structure of European society, the patterns of landholding, agricultural production, what used to be called feudalism, but mostly refer you to the textbook for further details to fill in the gaps. I'll point out among the most important changes in society in this period, in the period we're looking at, is the dramatic population increase from roughly 950 to 1300 or so, when the plagues halted 3 centuries of population growth. Over that period, the population of Europe roughly tripled. But when this population growth diminished and when population decline set in, the institution of the university had already successfully enough inserted itself into the various different mechanisms that allowed for European society to operate, that it managed to survive and even thrive under those situations of increased conflict resulting from such dramatic demographic changes as the Black Plague, the decrease in the available manpower, the collapse of prices, all of which are detailed also in the textbook. This population growth required, and also in a complex feedback mechanism, through a complex feedback mechanism, made possible a dramatic increase in food production that was achieved by a combination of clearing forests and reclaiming less manageable arable land for food production, and also compared to later periods of population growth, a relatively modest but notable improvement in agricultural techniques and equipment, which produced a marginal but significant increase in productivity, measured particularly in an increase in the yield per acre per hour worked. There was more food available given the same unit of labor and land and production factors applied. This period also saw a significant growth in towns, both in terms of the founding of new towns and also, and probably more significantly, in the growth in size of many existing towns. Urban life came to represent a larger percentage of the European population. The growth of towns in this period is a key element for understanding the rise of the university. Towns existed to a considerable degree to facilitate the exchange of the surplus goods produced by those conditions I just described. The increased productivity, the land productivity, food production productivity over the entire period we're looking at increased at a marginally faster rate than the increase in population, allowing for surplus food production, which in turn created the possibility of increased commercial use of that produced food. The medieval scholar historian Chris Wickham put it like this: the movement of goods and people became overall far more extensive, particularly after 1150 or so, and the exchange complexity of Western and Southern Europe began to extend to the north as well. For our purposes, it's the increase of exchange complexity and the responses to that increase in exchange complexity that needs to be attended to. The universities were ideally suited to supply the demand that one of the consequences that these changes imposed on the institutions. The growth of the university can be seen as both a response to the expanded need for people able to produce and to respond to written documents that allowed for the management of these increasingly complex exchanges that characterize European society under the conditions of population growth and increased food productivity, including, crucially, the production of surplus goods, the production of the means of livelihood that exceed the immediate demand of the producers. And so the universities respond by producing people who are able to generate documents, and also a mechanism through which the scope of that response would be integrated into wider and wider areas of human interaction. And so the charter in 1215 is intended to be an example of how these mechanisms, seen as a technology of power, used to regulate conflict, to make conflict less expensive, to diminish the extent to which conflict hinders the ability of society to carry out all of the many different tasks that it carries out in the process of allowing for human survival and, under some circumstances and for some segments of the population, to thrive. Again, quoting Wickham, a greater use of writing, the growth of concepts of accountability, the growing complexity of law, and a slow increase in ideas of problem solving were all important developments in this period, and all had an effect on how political practices worked. These developments link as well to the concurrent development of a much more complex environment of intellectual inquiry and to new forms of local religious practice, which were challenging to the growing centralization of ecclesiastical legitimacy. That was from Wickham's book, Medieval Europe, page 142. The university expanded because it produced an increasing number of people who could respond to all of these changes and through which these changes were institutionalized. Problem solving, accountability was one of the themes that the university masters developed in their own writing, and was one of the products that they generated, one of the abilities that their teaching of the scholars produced. But more importantly, it also produced an atmosphere, as Wickham mentioned, a culture of inquiry that attempted to systematize the conditions necessary for the use of argument as a conflict resolution mechanism. Logic, grammar, rhetoric, all of these textual strategies originally developed to better understand the Bible, to better fulfill the requirement of the priests as mediators between the Word of God, manifested as the Bible, made real in the person of Jesus, integrated into the community through, among other things, the sacrament of the Eucharist. All of these are the object of and the topic of the intellectual work that the masters in these universities undertake. And the work is undertaken in order to prepare the priests to take up that role in their communities. And furthermore, to engage those communities in which they're undertaking this work to see themselves as members of that community in those terms. Over time, this culture of inquiry increasingly turned inward, and the discursive procedures, that is the focus on logic and rhetoric and grammar, increasingly turned inward. And the discursive procedures that the medieval university imposed on itself became so specialized that the parish priest, the provincial lawyer, the imperial diplomat, and the urban tradesman were no longer able to recognize in the writings of these university masters the everyday realities they encountered. On the other hand, that effort at systematizing the ability to master written argument and to recognize oneself as bound up by the norms instituted through those mechanisms, through that combination of written texts as the expression of appropriately communally recognized authority on the one hand, and seeing oneself as bound by those strictures, produced succeeded in instituting a kind of status quo within the society that increasingly operated independently of the continued production of the scholarly work. This university discourse came to be known as scholasticism, and later intellectuals from subsequent eras, starting in the Renaissance, increasingly began to share the contempt expressed by the urban tradesman and the provincial lawyer and the local peasant. So the university's legacy to the modern world is built on the unintended consequences of its initial purpose, training priests. In order to train the priests, committed, as we saw, to spreading the will of God, manifested as through the words of the Bible, and charged with the mission of preaching that word, the teachers and trainers had first to not merely learn to read the Bible, but to understand it well enough to instruct priests so that these priests themselves would be able to explain it to the parishioners. They had to teach the teachers not just the subject matter, but also how to deliver that subject matter so as to achieve the institutional purposes that allowed the church and the university both to survive. In this quest to understand, the procedure they adopted was to compare their interpretations against competing interpretations, to see how glossing and interpreting a given verse from the Bible in light of another verse of the Bible, that is a comparative analysis of texts, the skill was passed on from the scholars to the priests. The contemporary historian Charlotte Methuen, contrasting the reading strategy of Christian theologians working before and after the rise of the medieval university, described it like this. In the universities, so quote, in the universities, the Bible was read not primarily for the sake of spiritual edification, as it was in the monasteries before the rise of the university, but as a source of knowledge about God. Although ultimately both approaches sought to reveal and comprehend the nature of God, the kind of knowledge they sought and their methods for acquiring it were very different. While monastic lectio tended toward meditation and prayer, scholastic university lectio tends towards the question and the disputation. Monastic methods of reading scripture had as their aim the contemplatio of God, whilst the schools pursued scientia of God by means of structured debate, which sought to distinguish truth from falsehood. It is the production of scientia through disputatio that has proven to be so powerful a cognitive strategy. And it is this strategy that survived the slow divorce between the university and the church. Maureen Miller argued, it's the practical, recall that Maureen Miller is another contemporary historian from whose work I quoted to describe what I meant by how I was using post-confessional. In that same article, she wrote, it's the practical ground level methods of organizing collective action, extracting and mobilizing resources, communicating ideas, and exerting pressure that need to be understood. Put another way, what were the technologies of power, the cultural and administrative practices that vaulted the papacy from being a squalid pawn in local dynastic squabbles to being a forceful and innovative actor in European politics and society? Although she doesn't take the argument there, I've tried to make the argument that we can better understand what the university does as being one of the locations of these technologies of power, and we can better understand those technologies of power when we observe them in terms of their contribution to ground level methods of organizing collective action, their contribution to extracting and mobilizing resources, communicating ideas, and exerting pressure that needed to be understood. These technologies of power capture the duality of the dual task I mentioned a few moments ago. What did the students learn in the undergraduate education? How to read complex texts, how to analyze these texts into their rhetorical, logical, grammatical components, and then how to generate texts using these same complex conceptual frameworks. Much of the attention that is paid to the content produced by the masters and doctors of the universities over the centuries is understandably focused on the works of Aquinas and Bonaventure and John Burden and all of the great thinkers. But just as today, the impact of the university education on the vast majority of its students was not so much by producing people able to generate a logically coherent synthesis of Aristotle and Augustine and Ibn Rushd, as Aquinas did, that is doctrinally acceptable with to varying degrees to both the king and the pope. After all, there's only one Aquinas. What universities produce today, in a way I'm arguing is similar to back then, is on the one hand, a large enough group of people who between them have the skills, but far more importantly, the attitudes and dispositions to function in the labor market in some kind of functional equilibrium of reproducing the existing expectations of society and adapting to the emerging conditions. But it's also, on the other hand, reproducing the mysterious effectiveness of sustaining the social bonds that hold us together, that help us defer gratification, to continue, for example, to wear masks, because university trained scientists whose understanding, for whom the basis for advocating these policies exceeds our own ability to understand. I don't understand DNA and RNA well enough, but I understand, or at least believe, that the university has produced enough people who do understand this. So when the university trained scientist says it will keep us alive, we believe them. We conform, we have our behavior conform to what it is they say. And university trained lawyers have drafted laws, and university trained parliamentarians have passed those laws, and university trained consultants have formulated marketing strategies that mysteriously, effectively have resulted in getting a great many of us to comply with mask orders. That compliance, in my own case, personally, subjectively, I absolutely want to wear a mask, and I want you to wear a mask, and I want you to want to wear a mask. It's the mystery of the effectiveness of the university that I'm trying to call attention to, not the mystery of it. That's the society we're in right now. Wearing masks is saving lives. The vaccines are saving lives, and when the internet connection quit. So I'll just finish up my last 3 sentences. That's the society we're in right now. Wearing masks is saving lives. The vaccines will save lives and eventually allow us to engage in the kinds of interactions we were accustomed to engage in before COVID. Those interactions are made possible, for better and for worse, in part by the effectiveness of universities in 2021. No longer operating in the context of papal legates struggling against the growing authority of knights and higher nobles. In 2021, the social dynamics have been transposed to competing multinational corporate interests and regionally or nationally organized interest groups expressing and exerting their power through the parliamentary democracy in which we live, all doing their best to influence the universities in all of its different roles. Thank you very much.